Hey y'all, Pastor Will. So, if you're watching this, thank you so much for joining us in either our private Facebook group or finding us at hlcbonita.org for the Bible study that we are going to continue to upload, hopefully every Thursday by either 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. I'll throw out updates to make sure you know. Now, this week is just going to be an introduction into our topic and give you an idea of what we're going to be working through, along with some scripture to read this week. If you go to hlcbonita.org or if you are at the private group, you can find in our resources either posted a few things for this week that'll be important. So the first thing that I want you to look for is there is a YouTube video discussing what we're going to be going through in the next little bit. There is a follow along guide that I'll be using to help guide our discussion. And then there is also a PDF of a report from the Pew Research Center that will be helpful. So before you do anything else, I want you to pause this video, and then I want you to go and watch the YouTube video and then just skim through the PDF report from the Pew Research Center. And when you do that, come back and then we'll continue on. All right, I'm going to trust you actually did it, okay? This is going to be very helpful. All right, so if you looked through that report, or if you watched that video, which was from about 5 years ago, you probably are just getting confirmation of something that you've probably witnessed over the last 10 to 15 years already, which is church attendance is in decline. If you looked through the report, which I'm going to pull up right here real quick, there was a few statistics that really stood out. One of the statistics that stood out quite a bit to me was really just how over the last 10 years, which would have been on page 8, if you go back and look at it, that the sort of things that get thrown out there as reasons for church attendance decline don't really hold up. Now, in the weeds of that report, you'll see other religions other than Christianity, and if you watch those numbers, you'll see they have stayed relatively flat. But what you will find is whether you're college educated or not, whether you're a man or a woman, the church attendance data is declining about the same. The only area that seems to have really leapt and accelerated and picked up speed is with the millennial generation, of which I'm a part. And that number was actually 16% point change, down 16% from 10 years ago in terms of millennials that say that they are Christians. And then for Generation X and for baby boomers, 8% and 6%. And what I'm seeing here is not so much that's just increasing, but that with anything like this, it seems to be growing exponentially. And what this report is not taking into consideration is the next generation after millennials, those that are born after 96. And my strong suspicion is that we are going to see that number increase more than 16%. So if you've watched the video, if you've looked over it, you probably know where this is going, which is it seems like a crazy time to be a part of the church. I mean, what do you do when it just looks like church attendance is decreasing? And I think before we do anything, before we dive into our Bible study, what I need to do is establish for you what our context is, okay? So the first thing I want us to really just get our heads wrapped around is that we are living in what is functionally turning into a post-Christian society. And this is something that you or I have not seen in our lifetimes. And in fact, I would say in all honesty, from the 16th century and maybe even before then, but from the 16th century, 15th century, all the way up through the 20th century, we lived in what you could really call Christendom. And now Christendom is sort of the catch-all term that is thrown around, which means that we lived in a culture that assumed if you were born in that culture, you were probably a Christian, belonged to a church. And everything that had happened in public life tended to be centered around the church. Actually, the church had a great deal of privilege in setting the rules and the norms of how society operated, how it worked. For example, as recently as 30 to 40 years ago, if you wanted to run for public office, well, the expectation was that you would be a member of a church. It was a privileged place. And I think it's fair to say that with this increased decline and people that say that they're Christians, we can say safely that increasingly the world is not governed with the church in mind. If anything, it's led to some really substantial changes in what it means to be Christian in our culture, what it means to be a part of the culture, and gosh, it can be really scary, right? For example, in a post-Christendom world, there's a lot of movement within Christians and church. You see that the life of the church moves from the center of culture to really the margins. And if you've watched news, as you've seen legislation get passed or whatever it is you want to talk about, and we can talk about the reasons why later, but for whatever reason, if you see that we have moved as a church from the center of public life to the margins. You're starting to see that in terms of being able to shape the narrative of culture, we have moved from the majority opinion to the minority opinion. Another thing that you'll see is that we are moving as a church from settlers, in other words, people that have a story that they're comfortable with, settled in their area, to sort of sojourners, a group of people trying to figure out what does this new culture look like. Another thing that we mentioned earlier is that we are moving as a church from a privileged position in society to one where we are part of a plurality. In other words, now it's not one voice dominating the conversation, but a number of different voices, all with equal authority at the table. Three other things that we see. One, we are no longer controlling the narrative. We are no longer controlling the direction of our culture. Instead, we are being increasingly shifted to bear witness about Christ in the culture, but not with a position to control that narrative. Another thing that is even more important is we are seeing churches increasingly have to move away from what it means to try to maintain their congregations. If you look over the last 10 years, it's, I think, a pretty comfortable thing to say that churches that have been trying to maintain what they have been shrinking anyway. And even if we look at churches that are, quote unquote, growing, often underneath the surface, because you have friends and family that have done this, if we look at churches that are growing, they are not adding new believers, but are simply taking believers from other smaller churches. The other thing that we would see, and to me, hopefully this will be the most positive movement, is the institution of the church. The idea of the church as something to be looked up to help provide guidance to the world. It's no longer a trusted institution the way that it once was. I mean, you turn on the news and there's always some new scandal that is taking place that is consistently eroding the trust people have in the church. We've seen that in our own community, much less what we see nationally. And then the fact is, as we move from an institution, we're seeing more and more churches try to figure out what it means to mobilize their members, what it means to start to look at what it means to be the church every day. All right, so that's fine. We've talked about that. So if you've got through your read-along guide, you're thinking to yourself, okay, so here's these things. I just want to do a quick self-check, something for you to consider. Now, if you've been a member of a church, or maybe you've had these questions, why aren't new people coming? Which of these shifts feels most challenging to you? So I want you to take some time when this video is done, look at that question and answer that for yourself. As you see those areas we're removing, and feel free to replay the video to go through this, which of those areas are sort of the ones that have hit you the hardest? Now, once you've done that, what I want us to do is start to think about a few of the reasons why we have seen such a speed up of the shift. And a lot of that is because our churches, as things have shifted, are really not designed to operate in a post-Christian culture. Really, they're set up to operate within what we called earlier Christendom, right? That assumption that everyone's already Christian. And so in order to grow the church, what you just needed to do was offer better programs, do a better job of engaging those kids, of parents, do a better job of just making sure there's enough on the buffet that people want to just come to the church. The assumption is they're already looking for a church. How do we make us the church they find? And quite frankly, that's built by design, right? If we are doing ministry built for the assumption that people are already Christians, that's not an accident. So I like this, and this quote's listed in your outline. It says, in Everyday Church, Steve Timmis, one of the guys that writes a book about this. He says, for all of its vital rediscovery of gospel-centered theology, the reformers, i.e. guys like Martin Luther, accepted that Christendom presupposition that Europe was Christian. In other words, as they were trying to look at the church, how to make it better, how to get back to the core of what it means to be the church, the assumption was that everybody was already Christian in their local communities. They just needed to be cared for better. And so the church's mission was pastoral rather than evangelistic. And that's just a fancy way of saying this, that the way church has been designed for the last 400 years has been primarily to care for people already in the community, but not necessarily to engage people that aren't. And even I would say in the 20th century, the 21st century, when I grew up in the church, most churches that did care a lot about evangelism were a lot more concerned with the de-church. And that's a fancy way of saying people that were already part of a church, but were no longer attending. And then those that were unchurched, those that were never part of a church, didn't really come into consideration. But we see that culture's changed, right? And so we see more and more people that not only never go to church, or people that have stopped calling themselves Christians, but there is one other stat in this Pew report that really shocked me. While we would see, and if you want to follow along, it's on page 10 of it, it says the number of religious nuns, those that don't have any connection to the church at all, while we saw people move from Christians to nuns from 178 million to 167, which is about 11 million people, the people that were nuns grew from 39 to 68%. Okay, it's a lot of numbers. What does that mean? That's a fancy way of saying that the number of people that left the church is being far outpaced by the number of people that have never been a part of the church. So what do you do when we try to figure out how to do church and it seems like everything is changing so much? Well, that's what this Bible study is going to be about. We are going to dive into one of Peter's letters, specifically 1 Peter, and we're going to look at what it looked like for them to be the church. And we are going to hopefully look to the past to be a guide for our future. So if you were taking part in this Bible study, what I want you to do this week is I want you to do a few things. This is it. I want you to read 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 11 through 12. That is Peter's introduction, and he sort of sets the scene of who he's writing to. And I want you to answer these questions for yourself. And then next week, I'll go into them in more depth. And then if you have any other questions, always feel free to email me. So the first question I want you to consider is this. What does Peter say, or it says, where does Peter say the church has their hope? So he introduces himself to the church and he says, we have our hope in this. And there's a hint. It's not going to be the Sunday school of just, well, Jesus, our hope is in Jesus. There's a specific thing that he has in mind. The other thing I want you to ask yourself is this. What does Peter say about trials and suffering? And in Peter's mind, are they necessary and why? There are two other questions to follow it up, and that is this. I'm going to give you some background. Peter calls the recipients of the letter exiles of the dispersion. Now, to give you some background, when Peter uses that, he is actually helping these early Christians refer back to an earlier event, and that is when the Old Testament people, the Israelites, had been exiled or carried off or kicked out of their country and taken to Babylon, which was a big, oppressive military nation. And Jerusalem's destroyed, and their temple is ransacked. So here's the questions for that I want you to consider. Why do you think Peter would compare these early Christians to those exiles in Babylon? In other words, what is he trying to get them to see? And two, do you think there's any parallels to these early churches that we're going to be reading about, that you're going to be reading about in 1 Peter and our churches today? Now that one will flesh out more. With that being said, my hope is that this Bible study will be meaningful for you. It will always again be posted at hlcbonita.org or on the Facebook page with resources to go along with. And if we have enough of an interest, my hope is that we can also have some Zoom meetings or in all likelihood some Google Meet meetings that we can engage with each other, grow together, and see what it means to be the everyday church. That being said, God's blessings, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.